We're going to move on now to the next item of business, which is a Scottish Liberal Democrat debate on Motion 20035 in the name of Willie Rennie on mental health. And I would encourage all members who wish to participate in this debate to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What I'm about to tell the Chamber this afternoon is quite shocking. It should shake the government to the core. I'm disappointed that Hamza Youssef, the Justice Secretary, is not here this afternoon, because some of the content of today's contribution should shake him to the core. It's deeply worrying about the state of Scotland's police. People across Scotland are struggling with their mental health. When they turn for help, it's often not there, or it arrives far too late. In the absence of enough support, problems that start small can become big. This week, I came into possession of the findings of new, unpublished, expert academic research into police officers' health. It shows many of Scotland's police officers are in that very position, struggling with their mental health, being let down by those at the top and let down by this government. The scale of it is horrifying. Here's just a few examples. 21% reported high levels of depressed mood. 1 in 10 reported drinking alcohol or taking prescription drugs as a coping mechanism. Almost half suffer from exhaustion. And this is the one that's most devastating of all. 35% of all officers reported going to work whilst mentally unwell. That is the officers that are keeping us safe in our communities, turning up to work while they're unwell with a mental illness. Just let that sink in for a minute. And the evidence is also there that they don't get enough support. 57% of officers reported that a lack of resources caused them high degrees of stress. And only 3% of officers agreed that the national force cared about their well-being. 3%. That's 3% thought Police Scotland cared about them. Exhausted, depressed, pushed into dangerous coping mechanisms. Look, I know it's a tough job, but the job shouldn't be making people unwell on anything like this sort of scale. The conditions our police are working in are fundamentally unsafe. This can't be dismissed. The research covered 6 policing divisions, including my own patch in North East Fife. The research team was led by world-renowned expert Professor Linda Duxbury, brought over from Canada at the request of the Scottish Police Authority, Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Federation and the other trade unions. And it couldn't be any more up to date. I just received it this week. When I challenged the First Minister earlier this month, I knew officer and staff absence had increased by 11% and 25% respectively. The First Minister's solution? Just carry on as we are. But the status quo, no change, won't repair the damage. And I was astonished to see that the Justice Secretary said that he was, and this is his words, very satisfied the support structures are in place for those officers for their mental well-being to be addressed. 35%, more than 1/3, turning up to work mentally unwell. 3% think Police Scotland cares, and the Justice Secretary is satisfied. He should be ashamed of such an out-of-touch and dismissive remark. Yes.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank Willie Rennie for taking intervention on the subject of being ashamed? Is he ashamed that the last Liberal Democrats in power oversaw huge budget cuts to mental health trusts, almost a third of NHS mental health beds lost, and mental health nurses posts slashed? Does he want to apologise for that?
Willie Rennie.
Police officers across the country will be listening to the Deputy Leader of the SNP. They will be furious that he has ignored every single word that I just said about the state of their mental health. They will be astonished, and he should be ashamed of ignoring their needs and their demands. It's outrageous that he acts in this way. Because Callum Steele, he made it clear as well. He said his level of satisfaction is not shared by the officers, and as such, it is difficult to understand the basis upon which Mr Yousaf was able to derive that satisfaction. Listen to Callum Steele. Callum Steele speaks for the officers of this country, and he is saying that he is dissatisfied with Humza Yousaf's response. 3%, just in a second, 3% think Police Scotland cares. 35% are turning up to work mentally unwell. The government should be shaking to the core. They should be worried about the state of our police. Neil Findlay.
Neil Findlay.
And it's the very same officers, when they turn up at work, are having to deal every single day with increasing numbers of mental health cases in their duties. And the officers I was out with over the summer told me that it's one of the biggest issues they are facing. And what they need is mental health officers in the police force working alongside them to address that on a daily basis.
Willie Rennie.
Well in touch with exactly what's happening is Neil Findlay. He understands the pressure that our police officers are facing, and that's exactly the issue I'm about to come on to. Because police officers aren't the only ones going to work despite being mentally unwell. It's happening across the country, in the public sector, in the private sector. And what choice do people have when adults can wait up to 2 years to get the treatment that they need? It's tough, and there is a serious cost. Waiting for an age for help causes their health to deteriorate further. I'm seeing colleagues in England complain, and rightly, about adults waiting for up to 176 days for psychological therapy. That's obviously not acceptable. I don't wish that wait on anyone, but it's well short of what we're experiencing here. I long for the day that people can get treated in 176 days, because adults in this country, in Scotland, under this government, are waiting for 700 days. The mental health strategy in 2017 was supposed to bring all that to an end. Scotland is so far behind, it's frightening, and that's why we want to see a transformation in Scotland's mental health services. I've spoken before about how the strategy was 15 months late. Just in a second, delaying critical investment. So I want to talk today about the progress made in the years since. In particular, the progress against Action 15. I'll read it out to remind members what precisely it said. It said the Scottish Government will increase the workforce to give access to dedicated mental health professionals to all A&Es, all GP practices, every police station, custody suite and our prisons. My party asked for this. We had discussions with Shona Robertson and Maureen Watt when they were ministers. In the end, we were promised 800 additional mental health workers in those key settings. While we disagreed with the figure, we thought at least it's a start. But the government has now diluted that commitment. The evidence is there in the Health Secretary's amendment today. The First Minister told me explicitly that government made a commitment and are delivering it. Only that's not what was promised. Now the 800 are only going to a range of places, including A&Es, GPs, police stations and prisons. The target now covers something called other settings. A third of the staff hired so far have been diverted to those other settings. Sam H want clarification. We want clarification. Will the Minister give us clarification?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for that, and can I just also take this opportunity to point out, notwithstanding his point about psychological therapies, which I do not dismiss, but 8 out of 10 patients are seen within the 18-week period for psychological therapies. There is a great deal more to do, but it is important that we're accurate in our depiction of the picture across Scotland overall. In terms of your 800 the commitment for 800. You will recall, I'm sure you will agree, that we take the lead from our IJBs who understand what the local need is, and so those other settings also incorporate work where people need that additional help and support. And as we come to move our amendment and close, we will give you more detail.
Willie Rennie.
I'm afraid that's fine, but that's not what the government promised. The government promised that it would go to A&Es, GPs, police stations and prisons. So far, we've had a miserly 7.5 personnel for the police. Just think the number of police stations that there are, custody suites, across the country. We've had 7.5 so far, and that's exactly what Neil Findlay was talking about. What on earth are we doing to support the police in the front line? What are we doing to support the GPs, to support the prisons? We've heard a report just this week on that very subject. In the A&Es, it's all well and fine for the Minister to come up with statistics to rebut my statistics. But until the government accepts that it's not delivering on the strategy that it's promised, that people are crying out for help, until the government recognises that, we're not going to move one step forward. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to speak to and move amendment in his name.
Presiding Officer, mental health is a priority for this government. It's not a short-term priority. It's not a here, today, gone tomorrow political issue. Instead, it's a significant challenge across the globe, and we in Scotland are determined to respond in an ambitious and systematic manner. Together with our partners in local government, the NHS, the third sector and the wider mental health community, we're focusing on an approach to mental health which encompasses prevention, early intervention and clinical services. We're doing this against a backdrop of a decade of austerity. This has impacted negatively on public services and directly on people across Scotland who rely on public services. The welfare reforms, which the current and previous UK governments have imposed on some of Scotland's most vulnerable people and communities, have had a particularly detrimental impact on the mental health of people who often need the most support. This government has a strong record of mitigating against the worst impacts of austerity and continues to do so. However, it's not realistic to argue that austerity, which was imposed on Scotland, has had no impact on the quality of life and therefore on the mental well-being of people across Scotland. I think I'll make a little bit of progress and we'll see if we have time. The government is taking a long-term and wide-ranging approach on mental health. We're working with delivery partners and service users to put in place meaningful responses to changing demands and expectations. Our total investment in mental health exceeded £1 billion for the first time in 2017-18 and reached £1.1 billion in 2018-19. Mental health will remain a funding priority for this government going forward. This includes targeted funding, such as last year's commitment to fund an additional 80 CAMS staff and a £54 million package of funding over the past 4 years to support access to CAMS and psychological therapies. As part of this year's NHS Board's annual operating plan process, mental health was one of the key priority areas laid out by the government. Boards were asked to provide plans to meet waiting time standards for mental health alongside plans for key aspects of physical health services. And this work will be intensified in the year ahead. It's important that we maintain a focus on clinical services, and we will always do that, but we also have to recognise that clinical response is not always the most appropriate response. For many people, earlier support focused on returning quickly to good mental health is the right approach, and we continue to build on this. In the 2 years since we made our commitment to funding an additional 800 mental health workers, integration authorities have been working to ensure that this new resource supports an early intervention and, where possible, a preventative approach to mental health. And I do think it's important that those 800 mental health workers are placed where they are.
Giving way. I noticed from the government motion you tried to delete the word crisis from Liberal Democrats. Now, the Royal College of Psychiatrists have said that Scotland is facing a workforce crisis. What does he think they're saying that for?
Minister.
I think when you look at the policies this government is taking in place, we are making stringent efforts to improve the situation, which is not something that's happening elsewhere in the UK. So there's a huge contrast to bring mental health into line with physical health, which is not happening elsewhere in the UK. And clearly there's a huge Barnett consequential from that. Innovative and creative examples are happening locally across Scotland, and I welcome the partnership approach that's being taken in prioritising this commitment. As of October this year, over 300, I'm going to cover some of the points that I think Mr Rennie made earlier. As of October this year, over 320 full-time equivalent mental health workers have been recruited, and we're on target with our partners to recruit all 800. And I do think it's genuinely important that government takes its policies, then discusses with partners, and I think it is appropriate that those 800 recruits are in the places where they will make a difference to people. So we are heavily committed to a range of early intervention and preventative services for young people. In partnership with our colleagues in local government, we're investing in school counselling in all secondary schools, and we're expanding the availability of school nurses. We're also investing in counselling across our colleges and universities. I think that's something which the Labour Party supported, but again, we need to remember that it comes down to money, and when it came to the money for these provisions, the Labour Party voted against the funding for those provisions. So through the work of the Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Programme, jointly chaired with COSLA, we're implementing some of the key recommendations from the COIA Task Force, the Youth Commission on Mental Health and SAMH audit of rejected referrals. This board will oversee the emergence of new community mental health and wellbeing services and support across Scotland. The programme board will also oversee the development of a new crisis service for young people in the year ahead. The Distress Brief Intervention Pilot Programme recently won the Care for Mental Health Award at the Scottish Health Awards. This is in recognition of an innovative approach which is providing an ask once, get help fast early intervention for people who present in distress and who do not need emergency medical treatment. There's a strong collaborative approach across different services. I'm wanting to cover one of the main areas that the member covered, so and time is tight. Through a strong collaborative approach across different services, the programme now provides support to well over 4,500 people, and that's been extended to young people aged under 18. Presiding Officer, I want to cover Mr Rennie spent a bit of time around police, and I want to touch on emergency services. Our emergency services work hard to keep people across Scotland safe every day, and their welfare is crucially important. They face challenging and at times dangerous situations which can have an impact on their mental well-being. The Scottish Government is committing £180,000 to extend the Lifelines Scotland Wellbeing Programme to blue light responders. Extending the programme will support the resilience and well-being of first responder staff in the blue light services to ensure that they feel supported, informed and valued. Now, Mr Rennie mentioned the research which was commissioned by Police Scotland, and I think that's an indication of an employer which is taking the mental health of its staff seriously. So that's good practice that they're wanting to understand what needs to be done, and we look forward to analysing that research when it is published. Presiding Officer, we've 10 years, a 10-year mental health strategy in place which emphasises the importance of good mental health alongside good physical health. Yesterday, we published an update on the strategy. The update presented a comprehensive range of work being taken forward across Scotland to deliver on and indeed to move beyond the original scope of the strategy. We'll work with partners, including members across this chamber, to take an organised and systematic approach to meeting Scotland's mental health needs now and in the future. So, Presiding Officer, in closing, I move the amendment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. And I call on Annie Wells to open for the Conservative Party and move the amendment in her name.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank the Liberal Democrats for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. Presiding Officer, no one in this Chamber can deny the growing recognition across Scotland for the need to embark on a step change in mental health support. A staggering 1 in 3 Scots are estimated to experience mental health problems, sometimes with knock-on effects on physical health, personal relationships, as well as work. the Scottish Conservatives believe that it is vital that we move towards parity of esteem between mental and physical health. We need to start valuing mental health just as much as we value other kinds of health. We cannot let it be seen as something that can be overlooked. It can't take a back seat. We've come a long way in how we value mental health, but there is still so much further to go. In this area, Scotland could be a world leader, but it's clear we are not right now, nowhere near it. The mental health theme programme for government last year promised speedier access to specialist care for all those who need it. Yet in that time, under this government, nearly a quarter of adults wait too long for psychological therapy. It's not good enough. This government has made a habit of putting out grand promises and not delivering. Mental health is just another area where the words of this government are not met by actions. This is particularly a problem among young patients, with the latest CAM statistics revealing that almost a third of vulnerable children are waiting too long for mental health treatment. Last year, an Audit Scotland report stated that mental health services for children were too complex and fragmented. Even the Scottish Government's own Children and Young People's Mental Health Task Force published recommendations earlier this year calling for transformational change to mental health services for young people. Urgent improvements to access of services must be made to ensure that all children get a speedy and appropriate diagnosis. Anything less is failing children and their families. We should be trying to tackle mental health problems as soon as they occur, at the earliest possible age. Instead, issues are going untreated and in many cases they're getting much worse. Latest figures also show a high level of mental health vacancies. The current vacancy rate of 8.6% across psychological services is the highest rate ever reported in June. And the Royal College of Psychiatrists have warned that psychiatric services in Scotland are facing a workforce crisis. And child services are once again in the firing line, with the college warning that data from their 2019 census reveals that 1 in 6 consultant posts within the service are unfulfilled. We welcomed the Scottish Government's announcement of 800 additional mental health workers by 2021-22. However, progress has moved at a glacial pace. More than 2 years since the pledge was made, the Government's own figures show that only 327 whole-time equivalent posts have been filled. In addition, the Government's pledge of 250 link workers has seen only 112, less than half promised, recruited so far. Presiding Officer, these targets must be met. Absolutely.
Jean Freeman.
Will Ms Wells accept that in terms of community link workers, we are halfway through the period, and so having half the number committed to would be a reasonable place to be halfway through, and that it is a collaborative effort with IJBs and local authorities?
Annie Wells.
I think we've got 1 year left in to recruit, and we have been seeing them moving at such a slow pace that I just want to make sure that these targets are met, and a commitment from the government would be what I would look for. So it's not only, if not, this will not only have a detrimental impact on vulnerable patients, but hard-working staff on overstretched wards as well. We can't expect staff to be able to fully help their patients when they've got far too much on their plate. As I said earlier, the Scottish Conservatives believe a step change in mental health support is required. We can be a world leader if we take the right actions now and not in 5 or 10 years. In the past, we have called for colleges and universities to appoint mental health champions for students, plans to have specialist mental health support in every GP practice or hub, and making sure that mental health support is provided in every A&E department on a 24/7 basis. Research has found that having a mental health problem can increase your chance of feeling lonely. And that is why this year the Scottish Conservatives launched our Loneliness Action Plan. Our plan includes an increased focus on youth loneliness, improving social prescribing, connecting communities, and the implementation of a national awareness campaign. And loneliness is a problem which can have significant side effects regardless of age. It can be linked to a lack of permanence or a lack of sense of belonging. It affects young people who often don't feel connected to the local community in this digital world, just as much as it affects the elderly. Particularly as we near Christmas, there are many people who simply don't have access to the company of others or feel as though they are isolated despite the many people around them. Ultimately, the Scottish Conservatives believe that there must be a parity of esteem between mental and physical health. That can't just be a phrase, it has to be met with the action that delivers for patients and staff. Presiding Officer, during this debate, one theme that will come up time and time again is change. A need for change in waiting time targets, a need for change in the workforce numbers. Even the Scottish Government's own task force is calling for transformational change. For the sake of too many Scots, particularly our young people, this change must happen now. Thank you.
I may have missed it, Ms Wells, but I don't think you moved your amendment.
I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. Now call Mary Fee for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking the Liberal Democrats for tabling this motion today on mental health? And can I associate myself with the, quite frankly, shocking statistics around police mental health that Willie Rennie so eloquently covered in his opening remarks. And I think it is worth reminding ourselves that the police are more often than not first responders, an increasing amount of incidents dealing with ever more alarming and distressing circumstances, and it is imperative that we adequately support our police force to do that. We all have mental health, and how we look after and treat mental health has rightly become a higher priority across society. Can I make some progress, please? Across society. Despite the higher profile of mental health, it's still not discussed and treated on a par with physical health. The Liberal Democrat motion raises many important points simply because there are so many concerns around mental health across the board. And it is right to say that there is a mental health crisis, although our colleagues on the government benches may not agree with that. And whilst not all of the causes may lie with the Scottish Government, it is only right that they bear the ultimate responsibility for that crisis. And waiting times for CAMHS, underinvestment in services, lack of staff and a scaling back of commitments are just some of the major issues as highlighted in the motion, and more should be done to invest in mental health, to create the parity between physical and mental health. And, Presiding Officer, the last release of Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service statistics showed that 3 in 10 children and young people are not being seen within the 18-week target. In fact, the waiting time target has not been met under the First Minister's time in office. And in 2018-19, over 5,000 children and young people waited more than 18 weeks to access services and support, with a further 7,000 being rejected for referrals to CAMHS, without little alternative or treatment options available to those rejected. These children and young people are being let down now, and the consequences could follow them well into adulthood, where the transition from CAMHS to adult services is a quagmire to navigate for many, adding to the stress and furthering the trauma, not only for the young person, but for the family as well. And that's why Scottish Labour has lodged our amendment with a special focus on children and young people. And the announcement made by the First Minister in 2018 for every school to have a mental health counsellor was welcomed by Scottish Labour, and it remains to be welcomed today. But sadly, as has been highlighted by Annie Wells, the pace of implementation means that hundreds of school children are missing out now on vital access to a school counsellor. What we have seen is a re-announcement of that commitment 14 months after it was made, and just days before this debate. And access to a school counsellor, providing the right level of support at a very early stage, has the potential to fundamentally change the long-term mental health and well-being of a young person. And surely that is the kind of transformational change that we all want to see. And going back to the motion, we agree that serious questions need to be answered on mental health worker recruitment. The Scottish Government promised an extra 800 mental health staff by March 2022 in A&E, in GP settings, in prisons and in custody suites. And the timescale for delivering on this is 50% of the way through. However, only 40% of the staff promised are in place. In fact, the promise has been watered down as a third of the new staff delivered are in other settings, not places the original commitment guaranteed the staff would be. And prisons in particular need access to more mental health staff, as we know that the prison population has greater levels of poor mental health. And given my long-standing work on supporting prisoners and their families, it's disappointing that the announcement appears to be watered down. Properly supporting offenders and their families is crucial if we are to break the cycle of reoffending. And I have seen all too often the impact of failing to support offenders with poor mental health. And it is vital that the proper support and help is available to all offenders, and more importantly, that that support is tailored to meet need. I joined up. Yes, very briefly.
Jean Freeman.
Very grateful to Mary Fee for taking it, and she will know that I share her commitment to the quality of work that is done with offenders. Will she accept that this has to be a collaborative approach? Otherwise, what we will have is that I will simply direct where any one of those 800 workers go. I don't think she'd like me to do that.
Mary Fee.
I absolutely agree with the point that the Cabinet Secretary makes, and I'm going to come on very briefly to that kind of approach. But we need to move this initiative along as quickly as we possibly can, because the longer we delay, the more people we fail. And that holistic, joined-up approach with good community support is crucial, as the point of release, as I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree, is often the point of crisis for many, many offenders. And, Presiding Officer, our amendment also addresses the unfortunate and tragic rise in the number of people dying from suicide. And it is regrettable that we have the highest rate of suicide in the UK. And if we don't deliver and fund the wide range of services efficiently and effectively before the point of crisis, then we won't see any reverse in the numbers of people dying by suicide. Over a year on since this Parliament debated the suicide prevention strategy, it is imperative that we reaffirm that commitment on suicide prevention made in September 2018 by backing the Labour amendment today. And finally, Presiding Officer, the causes of poor mental health are wide-ranging. Inequalities such as poverty can often exacerbate the mental health of the most disadvantaged. Only by ending austerity and properly investing in mental health services for all can we create a country that supports and treats the mental health of people and ensures the parity we all wish to see between physical and mental health. And I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Now call Alison Johnson for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by saying my thoughts are with all of those who have been affected by suicide and by mental ill health. And I'd like to thank the people in our frontline services who are working so hard to tackle what seems like a fast-growing epidemic. Now, Willie Rennie focused on the impact of mental health on those serving in our police service. And earlier this year, Callum Steele, the General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, said that Scotland was in the midst of an acute mental health crisis. So that's very much how it feels for those who are on our front lines, and they absolutely need our support in tackling this. I think it's welcome that we have an opportunity to debate this afternoon. No one in this chamber would deny that the figures around CAMS and youth suicides are completely unacceptable, not to mention extremely distressing. 7,518 children and young people, 1 in every 5 that asked for mental health support, have been refused help from CAMS since the audit of rejected referrals was published, while child suicide rates were recently reported to have risen by 160% in Scotland. The Scottish Greens support a preventative approach, and we back calls for teachers to receive mental health training, as they are a constant and stable presence in the formative years of children and young people. Research conducted, however, by the Mental Health Foundation Scotland last year revealed that many teachers lack the training and the confidence to help them address mental health concerns with their pupils. Now, I appreciate that the Scottish Government has committed to ensuring that all secondary schools across Scotland have a counsellor from 2020 onwards, but it's absolutely clear that this requires a whole school approach. Giving teachers mental health training could aid early intervention while helping them address their own their own well-being, improve retention and lower levels of burnout. But it absolutely has to be properly resourced, and it mustn't be yet another responsibility piled onto overburdened teachers. I mean, in terms of adult mental health, I think it's clear that employers have a really important role to play in prevention. This week's Unison Week reported that mental health causes over 70 million working days to be lost each year. 300,000 people with a long-term mental health problem lose their jobs each year in the UK, and in 2018, over 870,000 people in Scotland were prescribed antidepressants. Now, this is an issue, I mean, it makes it clear that this is an issue that affects every workplace, and it requires a collective, holistic response. So I think as employers, and we're all employers, we can be part of that response. We need to foster an open and supportive workplace culture by making it clear that mental health will be treated the same as physical ill health, and embedding and normalising discussions about mental well-being in everyday work conversations. I'm sure none of us would hesitate to come in and say to our colleagues, I've got a stinking cold, or I have a sore throat. I'm sure that there wouldn't be, there's certainly a reluctance in many cases, in too many cases, to discuss how we feel, how our mental well-being is, our mental well-being and our mental health. And a preventative approach has also got to be taken. Now, it's clear that the government are not entirely responsible for the devastating impact that UK welfare reform has had on the mental health of too many people in Scotland. Earlier on this afternoon, I was chairing a meeting with Menu for Change in the building, and it came up time and time again. We were discussing the fact that we want to see an end to the need for food banks in this country. And the point was made over and over again about the impact of food insecurity, work insecurity, poverty in general is having on people's mental well-being. When you don't know where your next meal is coming from, it's very hard to have robust mental good health. We know too, universal credit is having a terrible impact. Sam H told us earlier this year that it's not working for people with mental health problems. A report they produced highlighted that work capability assessments aren't appropriate for people with mental health problems. They don't adequately gauge the impact of those problems, and indeed other fluctuating conditions that might fluctuate, and that many assessors simply don't have an understanding of mental health and well-being that means they are fit to carry out those assessments. And the stress it causes does nothing to help people with mental health problems. I think it's important too, and I appreciate work's going on to ensure that Social Security Scotland staff who interact with people with mental health problems have the training to make sure that they do so with compassion. You know, we need to... Yes, certainly.
Emma Harper.
For taking that intervention. I'm aware that the Scottish Government has spent about £100 million every year mitigating the costs of welfare-imposed austerity by the Tory government. Would you not agree that it would be better spending the money on public services rather than mitigating Tory welfare-imposed austerity?
Alison Johnson.
Absolutely, and I think any social security system, that is worthy of that name should be taken a remarkably different approach to the one that we see. Now, we all have mental health. Colleagues in the Chamber have mentioned this, and helping people to be able to identify warning signs, triggers, stressors, as well as to develop coping mechanisms can help grant some autonomy over mental well-being. And Mind, the mental health charity, are clear that resilience is something that can change over time, and that elements that build resilience can be introduced into everyday life. But as I've said before, it's hard to feel resilient when a day-to-day life is such a struggle. I mean, I think it's absolutely clear any preventative approach for good mental health has got to address the link between mental health and inequality and poverty. I mean, a report by the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute revealed that 86% of respondents said their financial situation and their mental health were closely interlinked. But people with mental health problems are often trapped in a self-perpetuating circle. They're unable to access the support they need when we have a punitive welfare system in place. And, Presiding Officer, I realise that I am running out of time at the moment, but we really need to do all that we can as a nation to make it easier for people to initiate conversations about their mental health to get the support that they require. Thank you.
We'll now move to the open debate. I have let the opening speeches run on a little bit because of interventions. So if people could keep to 6 minutes, please. Liam MacArthur, followed by James Dornan.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Liberal Democrats have chosen to use our time today to give this Parliament a chance to debate what I think can only be described as the crisis facing mental health services in Scotland. And it's right we do so. It's consistent with the priority that my party has attached to mental health issues over a number of years, keeping mental health at the top of the political agenda, holding the SNP government to account on its record, and demanding the sort of transformative change we need to see in an area for too long overlooked and under-resourced. And I too, like Alison Johnson, pay tribute to all those working in this sector. As Willie Rennie rightly reminded the Chamber earlier, people across Scotland are struggling. When they turn for help with their mental health, it is often not there, or it arrives too late, by which point manageable problems have turned into full-blown crisis. I see this at a local level, whether in the lack of psychiatric input available or a child and adolescent mental health service stretched to breaking point, trying to cope with the demand for help and support. And on this last point, I welcome the specific focus Mary Fee's amendment gives to the problem facing CAMHS teams across the country. Annie Wells, I think, was right to remind us that a third of children and young people are waiting too long for the support that they need. And Alison Johnson, I think, highlighted the fairly shocking statistics around suicide amongst young people. And it's not just those experiencing poor mental health that are being let down. I was contacted earlier this week by a constituent who described her experience of caring for a family member dealing with mental health and addiction issues. She says, I went to the doctor where they told me that my feelings of complete despair was completely normal. They say that they see this time and again as part of families dealing with addiction. Not once at any of the appointments or admittance to A&E did they offer me support or ask me if I was coping. In fact, they put the onus back onto me. As a direct result of the lack of initial help and support, my constituent and two family members found themselves needing 8 additional visits to the doctor, 2 prescriptions for long-term antidepressants, 1 5-day stay in hospital, an ambulance call-out, and 2 referrals to the mental health teams. That can't be right on any level, Deputy Presiding Officer. It shows a lack of joined-up thinking, services struggling to cope, and a situation made far, far worse by not being addressed in a timely fashion. Yet the government's amendment today gives no sense that ministers grasp either the scale or the urgency of what needs to be done to address this crisis. This is perhaps best illustrated by the complacent dismissal of concerns regarding the welfare and well-being of our police officers and staff. The findings of the new report in academic research referred to by Willie Rennie must surely have acted as a wake-up call for ministers. It confirms what earlier surveys, as well as a wealth of anecdotal evidence, have been telling us for some time. Police officers and staff are struggling with their mental health, being let down by those at the top and by this government. The full report will be shared with the Justice Subcommittee on Policing in due course, but the details provided so far by the Scottish Police Federation in response to Willie Rennie's inquiries are alarming. 35% of officers reported going to work while mentally unwell. 21% reported high levels of depressed mood. 1 in 10 reported drinking alcohol or taking prescription drugs as a coping mechanism. Almost half of officers suffer from exhaustion. In response, Jean Freeman's amendment asks us to support initiatives being undertaken by Police Scotland to create a safe, positive and healthy working environment. When 57% of officers reported that a lack of resources to do the work caused them high degrees of stress, and only 3% of officers agreed the National Force really cared about their well-being, that is not an adequate or an appropriate response from this SNP government. It is a response, however, no thank you. It is a response, however, that is becoming all too familiar. It is very much of a piece with the response given by the Justice Secretary when confronted recently with evidence of a sharp rise in police officer and staff absence. If the Justice Secretary really feels comfortable saying he is, quote, very satisfied the support structures are in place for those officers for their mental well-being to be addressed, again, it hardly conveys the impression that Mr Youssef or this government has grasped the scale, seriousness or urgency of the issue. I thought Callum Steele showed remarkable self-restraint by suggesting the Justice Secretary's level of satisfaction is not shared by the officers, and as such it is difficult to understand the basis upon which Mr Youssef was able to derive that satisfaction. We ask our police officers and staff to do a difficult, often dangerous job on our behalf. Rewarding them with platitudes while dismissing their clear and consistent calls for more support is not good enough. It's a tough job, but the job shouldn't be making people unwell on this scale. That's unsafe and cannot be dismissed, nor can ministers dismiss the findings of this research as historical or somehow overtaken by measures that the police chiefs and they themselves have put in place. Professor Linda Duxbury's research could not be more up to date. What's more, it could not underscore more powerfully why Police Scotland, the SPA and SNP ministers were wrong to reject our repeated calls for staff views to be surveyed well before now. Having dodged this issue for too long, Professor Duxbury's report leaves this government, police chiefs and the SPA nowhere else to hide. They must act, and I urge Parliament to back the motion in Willie Rennie's name. Thank you.
James Dornan, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in today's debate as someone who's been public about my own past mental health problems. I have huge sympathy for those officers affected by the same. I have come to work, but on many occasions suffering from poor mental health. And I would like some more detail and scale of how unwell the police officers have been, as it ranges hugely from feeling stressed about a particular issue that you're going in to face, right through to being so depressed, so out of it, that you feel like you're going to commit suicide. And I've done every single one of those stages. So I know that you can't say that such and such a percent feel unwell and that they're all the same. Now, if there's a huge percentage that are at the top end of that, then there's a real crisis on our hands. But if we're finding that a lot of them are people who are suffering with stress, which every single one of us do, and I've got to be honest, I was stressed before I started this speech today, that is not of the same magnitude, and yes, I'm happy to take an intervention.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
James Dornan giving way. Is the member telling the Chamber that police officers who are revealing this stress to researchers should just suck it up and get back to work?
James Dornan.
Yeah, what I think you should do is, you should listen to what I say, and then you should intervene based on what I say, not on what you would like me to say to get your intervention in.
Would members remember to speak through the chair, please, and not directly to each other? Mr. Dornan.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. I mean, it's clear there's lots to do. This Scottish Government has, though, made incredible strides in mental health support in recent years. Over the life of the Parliament, investment in mental health will exceed £5 billion, and mental health staffing has increased 76% since the SNP came to office. It's a priority area for the Government. Myself, and I'm sure the Parliament as a whole, alongside Emma Harper, I'm privileged to be one of the co-conveners of the Parliament's cross-party group on mental health. At the moment, we're looking into the Scottish Government's ambitious mental health strategy, 2017 to 2027, and in particular the strategy section on prevention and early intervention. As we know, over the decade of the strategy, the Scottish Government's guiding ambition for mental health is simple. We must prevent and treat mental health problems with the same commitment, passion and drive as we do with physical health problems, as has been mentioned by others already. And before getting to the main section of my speech, I do want to pay tribute to the Group Secretariat, Susie Martin of SAMH, whose drive and commitment is taking the cross-party group onto new levels, as I think Emma Harper will vouch for as well. As one of the conveners of the CPG, I'm well aware of the great work the Government's doing to improve Scotland's mental health service, and I believe it's fundamentally flawed for opposition parties to try and claim otherwise. We're in the start of a 10-year programme, and what you're saying is, why have we not got it all done in the first 6 months or 2 years? Since the new Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport and the Minister for Mental Health have took office, the Scottish Government has established a Children and Young People's Mental Health Task Force, backed with £5 million of additional investment to reshape and improve child and adolescent mental health services, published 2 annual reviews, one of which was released yesterday into the mental health strategy, showing that of the 40 actions laid out, 19 are complete or nearly complete, and 20 are in progress. The Government has set up an independent review of mental health legislation in Scotland, launched Scotland's Suicide Prevention Action Plan, which among different actions sets an ambitious target of reducing suicides by 20% over 5 years, and as part of this established a National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group. The Scottish Government's vision of Scotland is one where suicide is preventable, and that anyone contemplating suicide or whose life has been touched by suicide receives the support they need. Presiding Officer, on top of all that, last year's programme for Government had improving Scotland's mental health at its heart. Within it, commitments to improve the NHS 24 breathing space service, the extension of online access to cognitive behavioural therapy, the expansion of perinatal support available to women, funding of an additional 80 counsellors to work across further and higher education, and additional school nursing and counselling services. And I'm delighted with the recent announcement that Glasgow City Council will receive nearly £5 million over the next 4 years, including £1 million this financial year alone, to ensure every secondary school pupil will have access to professional counselling services by next year if they need it. These actions, which are not an exhaustive list, represent a transformational change in the way our mental health services are delivered. Obviously, our mental health landscape has changed radically since 2017. However, many of these changes will take time before results can be fully evidenced. Presiding Officer, the Liberal Democrats, to their credit, have repeatedly championed mental health over the years. However, I believe a little introspection from them is in order for today's debate, because no matter how good our mental health policies are, health policy alone is not enough. The coalition that was discussed earlier presided over brutal cuts and austerity measures, and the effect that this has had across the UK in relation to mental health cannot be ignored. Such policies demonstrably have had disproportionate impact on people living in poverty and people with health problems, including mental problems, are overrepresented in this group. As revealed in a report earlier this year, bosses in and around 9 out of 10 NHS mental health trusts in England said that they believe benefit changes in recent years have increased the number of people with anxiety, depression and other damaging conditions. Lack of money and housing were also said to be contributing directly to increased demand for mental health support. And to confirm this view, we only need to look at the report of the UN Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, which said living in poverty can also take a severe toll on physical and mental health. More than a quarter of working-age people in the poorest fifth of the population, roughly those in poverty, experience depression or anxiety. It's clear the impact of growing social and economic hardship in local communities because of austerity is devastating and exacerbating the mental health problem for so many people. With all the will in the world, mental illness does not exist in a vacuum. Politics and our health, especially our mental health, are intrinsically linked. What we should be doing as a parliament is not trying to score points off of this. We should be working together to make sure that everybody gets the best mental health that they can, and that's what I'd urge the parliament to do at 5 o'clock tonight.
Ryan Whittle, followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also thank the Liberal Democrats for bringing this debate to the Chamber and allowing us to discuss mental health once again. I think it's an indication of the seriousness of this issue that there is a significant piece of work being done by the Petitions Committee, which is combining several petitions with mental health at its centre. We've taken evidence from a wide range of stakeholders, including recently at a teachers' conference, which was designed specifically to discuss mental health, both for pupils and staff. I think the overwhelming ask was to ensure that teachers have access to mental health training and support as part of their education. I think Alison Johnson brought that to the fore in her speech. When we're talking about teachers, we may as well throw in there the police, as Willie Rennie has so eloquently talked about, or our ambulance services, and on and on. And Gail Ross and I heard from secondary school pupils with lived experience of poor mental health, and what was highlighted there was their inability to recognise poor mental health in themselves, and also even having, if they could recognise it, having no real plan of action should they feel their mental health sliding. I've always said in this chamber, I thought that education is a major solution to health and welfare, and it is my strong belief that investment in this area could go a long way to preventing mental health issues downstream, and at a much reduced cost to the public purse, over and above the most important outcome, of course, which is much better health and well-being in our school pupils. And given that so many of those in poor mental health began that slide at school age, surely this is an obvious area for investment. I often thought if you want to really see the attainment gaps close, I think we need to focus on well-being. And this was backed up this morning when I chaired a conference on additional support for learning in Scotland, where the conference noted that additional support needs for pupils had significantly increased over the last 7 years, with a corresponding decline in the support needs teachers. The result, they say, is poorer mental health, as well as teaching staff under increasing pressure. And this will only appear on a balance sheet, a health balance sheet, further down the stream at a much greater cost. You'll not be surprised to hear that the Health and Sport Committee have also taken this issue up. And one of the evidence sessions we had recently highlighted, I think, another major element of the solution, that of social prescribing. And there's a recent investigation we've done in that, and that report is due out soon, and I think that's going to be quite hard-hitting. We had a round-table discussion. It was a great round-table discussion, but really only just backed up everything we already know. A more connected social prescribing model would make great inroads into that preventable health issues, such as poor mental health, as an alternative to continually medicalising the problem. Again, on Monday night in Perth, we heard from psychiatrists that suggested that that kind of approach would help to clear the way for those with significant and long-standing mental health problems that could be seen much more timorously. The problem, of course, is that kind of support, that kind of social prescribing, there's a huge lack of access to and a lack of understanding of that within this sector. And that brings me on to third sector organisations. That non-clinical environment, I think, that has a major solution to this. That is about delivery of service. It's not necessarily being hung up on the bricks and mortar of NHS facilities. Last night I was at Tynecastle to see the Changing Room project, which is supported by SAMH and the SPFL Trust, as well as Big Hearts. In that room were men who had stated they were unable or unwilling to access traditional mental health services. But in that environment, where there was no stigma attached to it, in that environment that they understand, they were able to talk and share their own mental health issues. And as part of that whole programme, they get access to physical activity. With one gentleman describing the men gathered in that room as his band of brothers. Two of them declared that they would have been suicide statistics had it not been for the group. That, I'll happily take that.
Jean Freeman.
Well, I couldn't agree more with everything Mr Whittle has said so far. Can I just ask him if he agrees with me that other setting in the 800 number indeed includes some of those places that he's talking about right now?
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention. I think that's the direction of travel that I am pushing Cabinet Secretary in, that I absolutely accept that there is investment in mental health. What I'm suggesting to you is that we should be looking at other areas to support in the mental health arena that can deliver the kind of treatments that we require. And I think for me that is effective mental health treatment, that non-clinical environment, taking the services to those who need it, and Hibernian do the same thing. And I think we could do much more with the right kind of investment. I have mentioned Ayrshire Cancer Support with their qualified therapists to you before, Cabinet Secretary. Break the Silence, again with qualified therapists, who suggest that they could carry quite a lot of the load if they were properly funded. Yet World, you know very well, and the Zone in Dalmellington, who are working with the most affected youngsters in that surrounding area. They have lost out on community funding programme, which seriously impairs their ability to deliver the service. So what will happen to those who lose that service? They will undoubtedly appear downstream in health or justice or welfare, with a far poorer well-being and a much higher cost of intervention. I think, Presiding Officer, if I could, the greatest failing of this Parliament is the fact that despite health and education being completely devolved to this place in the last 20 years, giving it the opportunity to evolve in a different direction, to innovate, I think it's continued to plough the same road, tinkering around the edges. And I think the definition of madness is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. Money is always going to be important as part of the solution, but just doing that kicks the issue down the road. Every policy in this place should have health and well-being as its central objective. Health and education and planning and welfare and justice. Only then will we actually effectively tackle the mental health crisis that is developing in this country. Deputy Presiding Officer.
Jenny Go-Ruth, followed by Neil Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think almost every speaker thus far has mentioned young people's mental health, and it will not surprise members this afternoon that that is where I intend to focus my remarks. Both Brian Whittle and Alison Johnson mentioned the importance of teachers in terms of supporting good mental health. And indeed, actually, my first members' debate was focused on this issue back in 2016. If you look at the school curriculum content in Scotland, an eighth of our curriculum is dedicated to health and wellbeing. And in fact, if you're really interested, there's a whole page of curriculum content devoted to mental, emotional, social and physical wellbeing. And that's before you reach CAMS, which I will come on to in due course. And indeed, as the Youth Commission on Mental Health Services report has recommended last year, mental health should continue to be embedded within education from an early age in order to strengthen the knowledge and awareness of mental health. That is a real strength of our education system because we prioritise literacy, we prioritise numeracy and we prioritise health and well-being. The Government's amendment today rightly points to a reduction in stigma around mental health, and at the same time we know that demand for mental health services has increased as people feel more able to discuss their feelings more openly. And as the Scottish Children's Services Coalition has reported, around 20% of adolescents may experience a mental health problem in any given year. These problems disproportionately affect those children and young people from lower income households and areas of deprivation. Presiding Officer, we had an evidence session this morning for the Education Skills Committee, taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary. There was a clear focus on exam passes, a number of subjects available, but none of us, and I include myself in this, none of us ask a question about the mental health of our children and young people. And I think that's quite a poignant point when you consider the debate around education at the moment. Now, Willie Rennie will know that NHS 5 have struggled previously to meet the 18-week treatment time guarantee when it comes to child and adolescent mental health services. But I know that the Scottish Government is working with boards to deliver on those improvements that are required. Indeed, there has already... Yes, I will do.
I'm grateful to the member for taking the intervention. I wonder if the member could perhaps give some indication to the Chamber what impact the member thinks that the very high numbers of rejected referrals for CAMS has on a child's attainment.
Jenny Gilruth.
I thank the member for that intervention. I don't think I'm able to give you specific a response to that, but I suppose speaking from a professional perspective, certainly in my experience, actually the front line sometimes of child's mental health is dealt with by a teacher before you get to the CAMS referral stage, and I'll come on to that in due course. I think there's a lot that can be done in the school community to protect and to build resilience within young people that we shouldn't ignore when we're talking about CAMS waiting times. So in terms of the investment the government's already committed to, you know, we've got 4 million rather in 2019-20 for 80 additional CAM staff. CAM staffing's up 4% in the last year and up by 76% under this government since September 2017. And in terms of intervening where boards are already falling short, the government has committed to intervening. However, I'd like to now come on to the point I made to Mary Fee there, which was to consider the opportunities that present before a child reaches CAMS to make those interventions. And think back to the design of our school curriculum with health and well-being at its heart. The Government amendment calls for a recognition of the commitment and contribution of those working across Scotland to improve services, implement change and ensure that mental health is given the focus that it rightly deserves. So I want to thank all those teachers who are working in my constituency who support young people in my community on a daily basis. And on that note, Presiding Officer, I want to share the story of a remarkable young woman that I met last year who was excelling at her local high school in Glenrothes. She was off to St Andrews University to study physics. She was a star pupil. But then something happened. Her mental health deteriorated. She had to be sectioned through no fault of her own. She was desperate to please everyone around her to get back to, as she said, being normal, whatever that was. But she just couldn't. And eventually, after a period in hospital, she made her way home and decided she wanted to help others. So she designed something called mental health distraction boxes, which contain items to help keep your mind active. So colouring in books, stress balls, you name it, they were all in this box. She recently delivered these boxes to her old school in Glenrothes and to another of other locations in the town. I really want to pay tribute today to Niamh Stewart for all her bravery in confronting her own mental health challenges in a bid to help others. Presiding Officer, the Liberals' motion today calls on mental health to be treated in the same way as physical health. But we all know this is not the case for a variety of different reasons, because if you break your leg tomorrow, Presiding Officer, we will all know about it. We will see you in a stookie, we might see a pair of crutches, people will ask you how you are. Mental health, however, is often hidden. It is below the surface, and because it is hidden, people often suffer in silence. That is wrong, and as such, the Government amendment rightly calls for parity of esteem, which I know is also the focus for the Government's mental health strategy. A lot of this is cultural. We know in Scotland particularly the unfair stereotype of masculinity pervades, the strong and silent man is lauded, and suicide remains the biggest killer of men under 50 across the United Kingdom. The Scottish Government's Suicide Prevention Action Plan aims to reduce the rate of suicide by 20% by 2022, which is welcome news. But mental health is not just about culture, Presiding Officer. Between 2010 and 2015, when Willie Rennie's bosses were in power in Downing Street, about a quarter of people on job seekers allowance received at least one sanction. In the same period, rates of severe anxiety and depression among unemployed people increased by more than 50%. The UK Council for Psychotherapy said the UK Government's reforms on welfare payments were to blame and that sanctions have had a toxic impact on mental health across the United Kingdom. Presiding Officer, the Liberal Democrats come to this chamber today to politic about mental health. They talk about a crisis, but when people like Niamh are in crisis, they point the finger rather than reflect on their own feelings when they helped to prop up the Tories in government. The Liberal Democrats are the enablers of a benefits regime which systematically harmed and continues to harm people's mental health and well-being to this day. They are the handmaidens of austerity. Shame on them, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Neil Findlay, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. And can I declare an interest? My wife and daughter work in the NHS and I'm a member of Unite the Union. There is, without any doubt, a mental health crisis in the community. In my constituency work, I see more people seeking support to access the services that they can't access themselves. And there are, of course, many reasons behind this rise in mental ill health: material poverty, unemployment, stress, substance abuse, violence, loneliness, low self-esteem, social pressures and a whole number of other reasons. The extent of the problem can be seen from the levels of antidepressants that are being described in our country. Information that I got in the summer from NHS Lothian tells me that in the previous 18 months, 900,000 items of antidepressants were prescribed. There are only 800,000 people live in the Lothian region. And for the whole of Scotland, that figure was 1.2 million items of benzodiazepines prescribed and over 3.5 million of SSRI antidepressants. Now, I'm not knocking the use of these drugs. I fully understand that for some patients, this is exactly what they need. But these figures are absolutely extraordinary. And in 2018, 67% of the drug deaths were from street or prescribable benzos alone. I'll give way to the Minister if he can tell us what is being done about the huge numbers of deaths from prescribed and street benzos that killed 792 people in 2018. Does the Minister want to take the opportunity?
Joe Fitzpatrick.
So thanks very much for the opportunity to take the intervention. There's a piece of work going on in the Scottish Government to look at prescribing specifically, but in addition to that, in terms of scripted benzos, in addition to that, there's work obviously in the task force looking at the range of support that is provided to people in that clinical setting to make sure it's appropriate.
Neil Findlay.
How many times do we hear there's a piece of work going on? How many times do we hear that we're working at something and yet we don't see any material change and there are people dying on the streets, 3 in Dundee last night? Yes, absolutely.
Point.
Monica Lennon.
Does Neil Findlay agree with me it's about time we had a debate in government time on Scotland's drug death emergency and to hear more about the strands of work being led by the task force?
Neil Findlay.
Absolutely. They shouldn't hide from it. They should bring it forward. If they're positive about what's being done, let's bring the debate, Cabinet Secretary, bring it forward and we'll engage with it. Yesterday, I hosted a group of pupils and staff from Whitburn Academy, Academy's award-winning Be Heard group, and they told me about their project, which addresses mental health head-on, changing the culture of the school so that pupils and staff and parents and anyone associated with the school can access support and a safe place for them to talk and begin to address a whole range of issues. I hope early next year to bring that project to a members' debate so we can all listen and learn from that amazing piece of work. But I want to raise some of the issues that those young people raised with me yesterday. They spoke about the unacceptable waiting times for CAMHS and how they and their peers suffering from things like eating disorders, self-harm or who have had suicidal thoughts have been left to wait for months or years for CAMHS support. And when they did get help, it was severely lacking. They told me it was only when their condition got to the stage that they were at death's door or when they had penned the suicide note, that they got the level of support that they need. The words of them, not me. Minister, that type of story is told to me in my constituency and in my region time and time again by desperate parents. It's an appalling state for our child mental health services to be in. If you're in mental health crisis, you need help today, not in 10 months' time or a year's time. They spoke about the waits for a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I have cases in my caseload where people are waiting 10, 12 months for a first appointment. So much for having a treatment time guarantee. This came off the Care Opinion website yesterday about St John's General Psychiatry. I've been in the mental health system for a long time. However, I've not been seen by a psychiatrist in over a year. My appointment earlier this year was due. It was cancelled due to there being no psychiatrist, not that I've ever seen the same one twice. Today I attended an open clinic. This is how they do things now. I had to wait for 3 hours. When I finally was called, I saw a nurse, not a psychiatrist. It looks like I will be discharged from the service without even being seen by a doctor. The person writing that is a nurse themselves. That's what's happening in our community. And we've heard people today talk about parity of esteem. There's young people tell me they hear politicians talking about that all the time, but nothing moves on. They spoke about the project that they've got needing to be rolled out in every school. And most tellingly, they spoke about the need to address the issues of inequality, deprivation and poverty, and the impact it's having on their health, well-being and their family, friends and community. There is an immediate crisis, and for many people there is nowhere to go other than A&E. And even when people are seen, and I've got recent experience of this myself, they are discharged from A&E back into the community with no idea where they're going to go, because they've often left a very stressful family situation or whatever, and they're just fed back into that situation in another cycle of problems. I know a number of people have visited the Penumbra Crisis Centre in Leith, where they take people on a self-referral basis, keep them safe for the night or a few days and help them access services. This is the only service like that in Scotland, the only one. We need those services rolled out across the whole of the country for emergency care when people are in a crisis. That's what we need. And finally, Presiding Officer, I was glad Willie Rennie mentioned the police. As I said, I went out in Livingston over the summer with them. All 6 of the cases we dealt with that day, all of them had a mental health dimension to it, some more extreme than others. The police told me they weren't trained to deal with it. They were trying their best, but it was a stick-in-plaster approach. So we need mental health teams embedded in our policing. I hope the Minister will raise some of these issues when he sums up.
Before I move on to Mr MacDonald, all parties have had extra time already. We're now running short of time, so please be stricter in your timings. Mark MacDonald, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by paying credit to Willie Rennie and the Liberal Democrats, because it's often the case when opposition parties use their debating time, they choose to split it between 2 subjects, and that often can lead to debates which can be truncated and can often feel rushed. So I pay tribute to the fact that the Liberal Democrats are spending their entire time debating what I think is an exceptionally important issue today, because it should allow for some deeper analysis of a very important subject. In terms of the debate that we've heard so far, I think that one of the difficulties I often feel is that the term crisis is used often in our public debate and often misused in our public debate. And there is no getting away from the fact that there are significant and serious issues within our society in relation to mental health and well-being. But it would also be fair to say that there is progress being made. At the most recent NHS Grampian briefing for MSPs and MPs, we were told by Lynn Taylor, the clinical director for CAMS in the North East, that now 91% of Aberdeen City and Shire patients are waiting less than 18 weeks to be treated. There are still some issues in the Murray area, but in the City and Shire, it's now 91% being seen within that 18-week period. But also, and Mary Fee raised the issue about rejection of referrals. We were also told that while it is true to look on paper and see 23% of rejected referrals, only 4% of those rejections relate to a failure to meet the CAMS criteria. Often it can be about the age of the patient who has been referred, or it can be about the fact that they are seeking advice rather than treatment, and that leads to a rejection in terms of CAMS treatment. So it's often worthwhile. Well, I've got a lot to get through, so if it's going to be brief, then absolutely. But what I would say is that there's often a lot that sits below the headline statistic in these issues. That's not to take away from the need to tackle issues, but I think it's important we do understand what sits below those headline statistics. I'll take a brief intervention.
Monica Lennon.
I'm grateful and I agree with the member about the need for that deeper analysis, but one of the statistics which really alarms me is the 160% increase in suicide by those under 18 since 2014, between 14 and 18. What does the member say about that?
Mark MacDonald.
Well, I was literally just about to come on to the issue of suicide and discuss that in perhaps a slightly wider context than just young people. But one suicide is a tragedy, let alone the numbers which we see in Scotland on an annual basis. And recently we had the opportunity as MSPs to undertake suicide prevention training, which was provided by SAMH. I attended a session with Liam MacArthur and also with Finlay Carson. And at that session, one of the key things which came across when we were talking about people who may get in touch with us as MSPs or may reach out to us personally was that often the vast majority of people, they don't actually want to kill themselves, but they get to the stage where they are unable to find anybody or to reach out to anybody who is able to convince them that that is not the correct way to go. And that, I think, in terms of what Monica Lennon is saying, I think that highlights the need for us not just to focus on places like CAMS and those, what I would describe as the points at which people are in the state of crisis, but needs us to take that step back and look at the early interventions that are necessary and where those early interventions are best placed. I think Jenny Goruth made some very important points around that, about how education can, for example, as a service, be more attuned to the needs of young people. But also we need to think about peer and community support. And I'll just highlight two examples from within the northeast of Scotland. And Brian Whittle mentioned those community charities or voluntary organisations. Aberdeen Man Chat was established in June of this year by a local stand-up comedian, Ray Thompson, as a means to encourage men, and we've heard the statistics in relation to men and suicide and the issues that Jenny Goruth highlighted about men being more likely to close up in relation to their mental health and well-being. It was designed as a means to encourage more men in the North East to be open about their mental health and well-being, but to do so in a more supportive environment and not feel potentially the stigma of coming into contact with statutory services. It has grown exponentially in terms of the numbers of men who are getting in touch with the organisation, and it is really having a positive impact and a positive benefit for the men who are attending the meetings that take place. Perhaps at the other end of the age spectrum from what Monica Lennon was talking about, the positive impact of men's sheds cannot be underestimated in terms of tackling isolation and loneliness, which can often feed mental ill health in relation to older men. These are both examples of community support which, as well as helping people, also are going to be in a position to require funding in order to be able to deliver that. And my question, I suppose, would be how we ensure funding filters down to these organisations rather than simply being about how much money we spend on statutory services, which are often not the first point of contact for many people who are affected by mental ill health. With that in mind, I would also say, in terms of the physical health debate, physical health complements mental health, and I've seen this firsthand in terms of my own involvement with Jog Scotland. I'm a member of a Jog Scotland group in Bridge of Dawn in my constituency, and for my own mental health and well-being, there are days where I've gone along to my Jog Scotland group, and simply that companionship, camaraderie, conversation that takes place during the jog round can be uplifting and can help get through a day when you felt like you didn't even want to get out of bed in the first place. But finally, Presiding Officer, and this is very much finally, in terms of the point Alison Johnson made about initiating conversations, we also need to think very carefully and reflect very carefully about the type of society we are creating for our children and young people to grow up in, both in terms of social media, which has been well rehearsed in debates, but also in terms of traditional media. When we have one of the main breakfast programmes in our country being fronted by a man who will mock men for being open about their emotions and talk about people's needs to man up, And when we have magazines which will bombard women with negative messages about their body image, either being too thin or being too fat, we have to ask ourselves about the impact that has on young people who are subjected to these messages on a daily basis and their mental resilience. Presiding Officer.
I'd remind everyone about brevity again. Beatrice Wishart, followed by Keith Brown.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. By virtue of the fact that the Cabinet Secretary begins an amendment to this debate asking to remove the line, and I quote, "There is a mental health crisis in Scotland," unquote, I'm concerned that the Scottish Government is failing to grasp the true severity of the mental health crisis that currently exists in Scotland. So let me begin my contribution to this debate by underlining exactly why that statement is true and why it should be a mark of shame on this government's record that they are seeking to remove it today. Mental well-being is plummeting in Scotland. So further to what's been highlighted by my colleagues, I see evidence of this in my own portfolio. A Mental Health Foundation survey reported that 51% of teachers said the pressures of their job had led them to develop mental health problems like depression or anxiety, or exacerbated an existing problem. The same research found that 71% of teachers said that they lacked the right training to help them address mental health concerns with pupils, and only 13% have received mental health first aid training. That level of concern is even more unsettling when sat next to research by the NUS in 2018 that showed that the number of students seeking counselling service doubled from 2012-13. In April last year, the Prince's Trust indicated that young people's happiness and confidence in their emotional health had dropped to the lowest levels ever recorded. But allow me to be clear, the purpose of today's debate is not to show that there are people in Scotland who are struggling with their mental health. The purpose of today's debate is to demonstrate how deficient our response has been so far. Waiting times for mental health services are too long. The targets for treating children and adults have never been met. People are waiting up to 2 years for the help they need, and for young people that must feel like a lifetime. The CAMS waiting time target is supposed to be met for 90% of patients, and it's never been met since it was introduced in 2014. This government often says things are getting better, but the latest statistics show that in the space of a year, the number of children waiting over 12 months for treatment has soared. In September, reports showed that 735 children waiting for over a year to start the treatment, and a year earlier that figure was 208. This summer we discovered that some people in Shetland have waited more than 600 days before starting to receive the treatment they need. 62 Shetlanders waited over a year to start their treatment, and the government's target's 18 weeks. And so a problem that may start as something small becomes much, much worse. And too often, as a consequence of that wait, comes tragedy. These waiting times are not just numbers that don't add up. They are evidence of individuals who have reached out only to find that the support they need just isn't there. For someone who's at their most vulnerable, that realisation must be crushing. And again, to be clear, the fault of this crisis does not lie with the staff who are doing their very best to work with what they have. They are working round the clock to deliver the very best service they can. But we don't have the systems or the staff in place to give the mental health the attention it needs. I'm not convinced, based on what we know so far, that we are doing enough to change it. That much is evidence in this government's attitude to workforce planning, given the widespread vacancies and the conspicuous absence of an integrated workforce plan. I recognise that our health service is already working with a professional deficit, which of course is going to be made so much worse if we allow any form of Brexit. And I recognise increasing the workforce by the numbers that are needed will be a massive challenge. But it is a challenge that we've already been defeated on if we do not even accept the basic premise of what these numbers show, that there is an emergency and that urgent action is needed to do something about it. And the cruel irony is that by failing to provide these basic interventions, we make everything so much worse. Too often, government spending focuses money on reactionary policies that only try to fix problems when they've reached this point. And instead, the third sector often picks up the tab on preventative policies, but without certainty on funding, these programmes often fall through, and the people who need these services are left in limbo. Spending time and money on our mental health services is an investment in our people, and by investing in our people, we invest in our economy and in our communities. So what more does this government need to be convinced of this crisis? Because the recognition is crucial if there is any hope of turning this around. Thank you.
Keith Brown, followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would want to say a couple of words, if I could, about what I think, from an expert point of view, are some of the underlying causes of mental health and the issues that we're facing. A couple of words about both the Scottish Government's response and the Lib Dem motion. And I do so with reference to two particular groups which haven't been particularly mentioned so far. There's been quite rightly a big emphasis on young people, but I think some words about older people and also about armed forces veterans would be useful. A number of years ago, 20 years ago, I served on a council where one of the councillors, a Labour councillor, confessed or said in public that he was suffering from something called SAD, seasonal affective disorder, and was roundly ridiculed for having said it. And I do think what we've had in the last 20 years is a substantial change in the way the public perceives these issues. So now people are very aware of the fact that when days are cut shorter, we have dark winter nights, that many people across Scotland will feel themselves struggling to cope with their mental health. And for some, especially older people, loneliness and social isolation can feel most acute during the holiday season. Others will already start to feel the pressure of paying additional heating bills and the stress over Christmas expenses. In relation to veterans, why we have to ask ourselves, is there so much more in the way of incidences of mental health cases being brought to light? Well, for what it's worth, my view is if you look back to the First and Second World Wars, where there's a much broader section of the population involved in those conflicts, when they returned from those wars, they were very much part of the mainstream because so many people had been involved in what they'd been involved in, shared the same experiences. Whereas nowadays, people tend to be isolated when they come back out of the armed forces and they have to cope with what they've seen on their own. I think that may perhaps account for some of the increase that we've seen. So given there are different reasons for this, and we should spend some more time, I think, if we have a chance, perhaps not in a debate like this, as to what the underlying causes in terms of modern life are for increased incidence of mental ill health. But I am pleased that the Government has recognised some of these additional pressures and are putting money into the pockets of those who need it most in these winter months, the young families, those with additional needs or those who have caring responsibilities. And these entitlements include the advanced December payment of the new carers allowances supplement, winter heating assistance, and together they make up the most progressive welfare package anywhere in the UK, and they do help to offset the crippling effects of UK welfare reforms since 2010, which has been mentioned by Alison Johnson and by others. So I do think there's a great deal being done by the Government. There's no question that more can be done, and I accept that. I think any government has to be liable to that charge and constantly be challenged. But I do have to question the basis of the Liberal Democrat motion. Given what Jenny Gilruth has said is their shameful role as a midwife to Tory government cuts, it's surprising today that Liberal Democrats criticise the SNP's pledged increase in investment in mental health services by claiming that the 800 additional mental health workers promised by the Scottish Government are insufficient. They appear to forget the toxic policies their party enabled as willing coalition partners. Policies that had I won't take an intervention from. The policies that had a devastating effect on mental health across the UK. When they were last in government, they oversaw mental health trusts being hammered by budget cuts, almost a third of all NHS mental health beds lost, and mental health nurse posts slashed. I know they don't want to hear it, but they have to take responsibility for the actions that they've taken. So I do think we should celebrate...
Mr Cole-Hamilton, I think the Speaker has made it quite clear he's not taking your intervention. Mr
We should celebrate the progress that's been made in tackling some of the issues around stigma, which I mentioned before, and whereby people do feel more comfortable coming forward to seek professional help. It is a great injustice, but during that time, as demand for mental health services increased, the Lib Dems and coalition government were working to undercut that provision. And I think that is the contrast with the things which the SNP government have tried to do. They've made strong commitments to supporting mental... I will do, yes.
Willie Rennie.
Has he got anything to say to the police officers in Scotland who are struggling in the way that they are, and especially how they feel about their bosses and what they think about them? Has he got anything to say to the police officers of Scotland?
Keith Brown.
I have just said that I wanted to try and focus on one area in particular, armed forces veterans, where some of the issues are similar to those that are suffered by the police officers. I think if you have a job, and it's true of emergency workers across the piece, where you're seeing very traumatic events on a regular basis, you're going to be subject to extraordinary mental pressures. I accept that point. And I did say earlier on, I think there is more the government can do. There's always more that the government can do. But I do think it's also important to take a balanced view and point to the things which the government have already done. And that's some of the things which have been done by the government will help those very police officers that Willie Rennie has talked about. providing intergenerational support for families and children, for example, to prevent and reduce the impact of adverse childhood experiences. Steps are being taken to improve mental health provision in secondary schools, as was mentioned earlier on. And in my area, readiness for learning, the approach implemented by Clackmannshire Council as a way of supporting mental health and well-being, is being extremely effective. So I think the result also of SNP Attainment Challenge funding has been helpful. Under the latest programme for government, the Adult Mental Health Collaborative was established to better support adult mental health services throughout the public services, and that, of course, it would include the police. So from a child who's experienced trauma to an older person living with dementia, the Scottish Government, I think, is trying to deliver a fairer Scotland for those dealing with mental health issues at every stage of life with dignity and respect. And Scotland, I believe, again, if the Lib Dem motion had recognised this, perhaps it would be more effective, is leading that across the UK. It's improving policy and practice. It's focusing on prevention, early intervention with integrated care. So when the Lib Dems call for the SNP government to elevate its ambition, their hypocrisy is difficult to ignore, given the shameful history they have of aiding and abetting Tory austerity. I believe the approach the government is taking is the one that can be trusted to help deliver Scotland's vision of a nation where people can get the right help at all stages of their lives. They can expect recovery and fully enjoy their rights, free from discrimination and stigma.
Jeremy Balfour, followed by John McAlpine.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would want to associate myself with many of the speeches, particularly by Annie Wells and by Willie Rennie in the debate today. But I would like to focus, with your permission, on that of postnatal depression and the effect that can have not on just many women, but many men and many families. As many of us in this chamber are aware that 1 in 10 women are affected by postnatal depression after the birth of their child. What surprised me when I was looking into this a wee bit more is that, in fact, the same number of men who are fathers to children also can experience postnatal depression in different ways. As we know, postnatal depression often comes on after the birth of a child, very early on after the birth of a child, but it can actually go undiagnosed up to when a child can be up to 2 years old. And I think one of the issues that we often look at is we see it as the kind of old baby blues in the first few months, but actually we forget that it can go on and affect both fathers and mothers up for months and years after the birth of a child. I think there has been good movement within society over the last number of years. I think we now see it as a recognised illness, that we see it as something that can be treated and helped with. And I think both doctors and employees and employers are far more sympathetic towards it. I did ask her permission before showing this, but my own wife, after the birth of our twins, went through quite severe postnatal depression. Initially, she didn't really recognise the conditions, and either did I, and it wasn't until a friend pointed it out that she was then able to get medical help. And I think that leads me to, the first challenge that we have here, and I'm interested that the Liberal Democrats do mention the issue of GPs within their motion, because for many, particularly women, but also for men, the need to get medication is important. But to get that medication, you do need to get an appointment with your general practitioner. And I'm sure all of us have often get constituents contacts to say how difficult it is now to get that initial appointment, either having to phone up or get into the surgery in time. And I do think we need to look at some system where there is a quicker way to be able to get to see your GP and to be able to get the necessary medication that you need to help you with that. But the second thing, certainly from my personal experience, that helped us was the self-help groups that exist around Scotland. If I can particularly mention one here in Edinburgh, that of Juno, which was founded back in 2015 by ladies, women who had had postnatal depression themselves, but wanted to then go on and support other women later on. and they run a number of groups, voluntarily led, where people can simply, or not simply, but they can go along. They can be listened to, they can talk, and people who have had that similar experience can hopefully excuse me, relate to them. I know actually the former Minister, Jean, went to visit the project about a year ago and was very impressed with it. But I think this is the second challenge that we face, not only from Scottish Government but local authorities as well, is that many of these organisations are grassroots organisations run by volunteers with no structure behind them. And actually all they require is a very small amount of money to be able to get some premises and to buy a coffee and to buy a tea bag. But often these are the organisations that struggle most to get money and funding because they don't have volunteers or experts to fill out forms to do charitable applications. They are, with respect, often ignored by joint boards because they are too small. And I do think there's a challenge for all of us within this Parliament and within our local authorities is how do we fund grassroots charities which actually need a tiny amount of money, but for that tiny amount of money makes such a big difference to many local communities. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I do think it's something we need to reflect on across this chamber about, yes, we do need to fund big charities and big organisations, but how do we fund the small local group, whether it's here in Lothian or in Ayrshire or up in the Highlands, that is helping individuals get turn their lives around and deal with real mental health issues, whether that is postnatal depression or so many other things. So I do welcome this debate today. I do think there has been maybe more politicisation that maybe needs to have been happened, because I think actually we all want the same thing. But I think the challenge for us is how do we collectively come together to not just score political points, but actually to help those who have these illnesses to get better and to live full and fulfilling lives. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
John McAlpine, followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I too was able to go out on patrol with my local Police Scotland staff over the summer and was very impressed by the work that they do, and indeed the work of all our blue light emergency staff across Scotland. The challenges they face with skill and courage, and these challenges can impact on mental health. And so the comprehensive extension of Lifeline Scotland programme assisting police, firefighters and ambulance personnel is very welcome indeed. Confirmation, as we've heard already, that the Government is committed to recruiting an additional 800 mental health workers across police custody, A&E, GP practices and prisons is also welcome, as is the news that nearly 400 of those workers are already recruited. According to NHS figures, at any given time, approximately 1 in 6 adults in Scotland experience a common mental health problem. Across the UK, mental health problems are a major risk factor for suicidal behaviour and are one of the major contributors to disability. But mental health problems are not equally distributed across the population. Adults living in the most deprived areas are approximately twice as likely to have common mental health problems as those living in the least deprived areas, and GPs are consulted twice as often for anxieties in areas of deprivation than in more affluent areas of Scotland. There is an established link between social status and mental health, with problems thought to result from the level, frequency and duration of stressful experiences and the extent to which social and individual resources and sources of support reduce their impact. The types of stressful experiences having an adverse impact occur across life and include poverty, poor housing, family conflict, unemployment, childhood adversity and chronic health problems. For some individuals, trauma experienced in childhood follows them throughout their lives. The links between adverse childhood experiences and poorer life outcomes is well established, and it's incumbent on us all to work towards a society where protective factors are in place to offset that damage. The Scottish Government is working hard across all 5 main areas of its mental health strategy to put protective factors in place that start at birth. In Scotland, we recognise that early intervention trumps crisis management, And we welcome the creation of the Mother and Baby Unit Centres of Expertise in NHS Lothian and NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and the community perinatal mental health services across Scotland. I'm pleased that the Government is listening to what young people say about their own mental health needs. Scotland's Youth Commission on Mental Health reported in May this year that young people need mental health support from everyone involved in their lives, not just specialist services. This commission, the first of its kind, is made up of young people, and they have recommended change not just to mental health services, but to the entire system. Standardised frameworks, a person-centred approach, reduced waiting times and a focus on prevention is what young people are asking for, with schools and communities embracing enhanced roles and responsibilities so that accessing the right service at the right time is possible for each child and young person. Another strand to getting it right for every child. The Scottish Government has listened and responded in key areas of provision for young people, including a national 24/7 crisis support service and self-referral community wellbeing services. It's investing £60 billion in additional school counselling services across Scotland over the next 4 years. In Dumfries and Galloway, one of the areas that I serve, this means an increase in spending of £1.9 million in borders and an increase of £1.2 million in fact, 7% of the funding is to be distributed to schools located in rural areas, which is good news for South Scotland and indeed other rural regions of Scotland. By September 2020, all secondary school pupils in Scotland who need it will have access to professional counselling services, including during the school holidays, ensuring continuity of care. The Scottish Government has already committed £20 million to increase the number of college and university student counsellors. Funding to increase the number of professionals working in child and adolescent mental health services has grown by over 50% under the SNP. Most of the additional £250 million invested in mental health over the next 5 years will be spent on services for children and young people. The children who need the CAM service are often at the sharp end of public service provision in Scotland. Children with the most acute needs, sometimes looked after children caught up in children's hearings. Whatever the route to the CAM's door, these are our children and young people, and they deserve a prompt, effective, well-resourced service. No such child should be turned away or have to endure a long wait. By investing in them, we're investing in the future of our country. In Dumfries and Galloway, which is part of the South of Scotland region I represent, more than 96% of young people are seen by CAMs within the target times. But that success is not replicated across Scotland. The service is rightly under close review, and the Youth Commission have recommended that the target time itself between referral is being seen is reduced to 8 weeks. The 2019-20 programme for government includes a clear focus on how the reduced waiting times for CAMs and psychological therapies will be achieved. For the first time, NHS boards will have to address trajectories in their annual operation plans so that funding is tied to performance, and reassurance should be taken from the fact that the Scottish Government has stated that it will intervene if boards fall short of delivering what's promised. Children and young people in Scotland deserve no less. Their rights must be observed, and I'm pleased that this SNP government is demonstrating absolute commitment to that obligation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I call Lewis MacDonald to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the Health and Sport Committee took evidence from senior management at NHS Tayside. We also met on Monday evening with members of the public and with people working in healthcare in Tayside to find out what they thought about local services. Lots of critical issues came up at all those meetings, but the issue that stood out above all others was the crisis in mental health. That is not confined to Tayside alone, but it is urgent in a region with exceptional levels of drug and alcohol dependence, suicide risk and mental illness. And when crisis point was reached, NHS Tayside asked Dr David Strang to carry out an independent inquiry into mental health services in the region. His interim recommendation was that the board should call a halt to their planned centralisation of services until the whole way the services were delivered had been properly reviewed. Despite that recommendation, the board have pressed on with their planned changes. Chief Executive Grant Archibald told the committee yesterday that they had no choice. If they did not make drastic and immediate changes, their ability to deliver training in the relevant disciplines would be jeopardised, and a far worse crisis would then ensue. He also told the committee that there was simply no way of filling all of Tayside's vacancies for consultants in psychiatry. The board therefore intend to set aside 10 of those vacant posts and to seek to recruit 10 nurse consultants instead. If the Chief Executive of NHS Tayside is right in his analysis, then there could hardly be a starker example of urgent and fundamental service redesign under the pressure of events as the only way for a broken service to continue to deliver at all. That means by implication that the people of Tayside have been let down over an extended period by an operating model in mental health which was no longer fit for purpose, if indeed it had ever been. Looking forward, David Strang's final report in the new year will be critical to what happens next, and his recommendations must surely carry weight, not just with NHS Tayside, but with government ministers too. The case for reform to the way services are delivered is also clear from children's and adolescents' mental health services in NHS Grampian, already mentioned by Mark MacDonald. 18 months ago, only 27% of young people were seen within the 18-week target in Grampian, significantly less than in other areas and significantly less than in other services. One of the causes of that has been addressed in the course of this year. Mental health services for young people in and around Aberdeen used to be spread across 3 locations on 2 separate sites. Children and young people might need 2 or 3 appointments just to access services, and mental health staff spent far too long travelling between sites when they could have spent that same time seeing more patients. It's no wonder that waiting lists were so long. Now the whole service is together, as the Cabinet Secretary knows from visiting it, on the site of what used to be the City Hospital in Aberdeen, a custom-built and user-friendly unit designed in part by young people themselves. I visited the new Links unit last month on the day Jean Freeman opened it, and it was clear that the change in the way that services were delivered was already making a real difference. The challenge facing NHS Grampian is, of course, very different from that in Tayside. Funding per head of population and therefore staffing levels in mental health are barely half in Grampian what they are in Tayside, and Grampian remains the lowest staffed young people's mental health service in Scotland. But even in Grampian, facing such fundamental challenges, it is clear that service redesign has made a huge difference in only a few months. Percentages can fluctuate from month to month, but the latest figure I have seen is that 70.8% of young people across Grampian now access services within 18 weeks, which is more than twice as many as in 2017. So that is real progress, but clearly more needs to be done in Grampian and elsewhere too. But I also want to acknowledge a remarkable example of a contribution to the improvement of services made by young people themselves. For their 10th birthdays in 2017, Jago and Carmen from Bankery got to go to see Ariana Grande at the Arena in Manchester. Those children were not injured in the terrorist atrocity that happened that night, at least not in any physical sense. But of course, the way they view the world was changed forever. And they resolved to turn their traumatic experience to benefit for other people of their age. They and their friends set up Kids for CAMS to raise funds for kids' mental health services in and around Aberdeen. They have already raised £14,000, and they were recognised for their efforts as finalists at the Scottish Health Awards in Edinburgh earlier this month. That was a fantastic achievement for a group of youngsters between 9 and 12 years old. Fantastic achievement for them and kids who are determined to raise even more money next year. And just as for those young people, so too for the NHS across Scotland and for the Scottish Government, there is a lot more still to do. Grampian and Tayside, in different ways, demonstrate the urgent need for reform, and local leaders who make change happen deserve support. But that leadership needs to be national as well as local, and that urgency must inform the whole approach to mental health services across the country going forward.
Thank you, Nicole. John Mason, before we turn to closing speeches. John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to take part in today's debate. And can I join Mark MacDonald in commending the Lib Dems for having one subject for the whole afternoon, because I do think that makes for a more satisfactory debate. I certainly agree that mental health needs to be taken equally seriously and equally urgently as physical health is. In fact, as others have said, we cannot completely separate physical and mental health from each other. We are complete human beings, and we need to look at ourselves and each other holistically. And I would throw in as well that our spiritual health is important too. Clearly, just as there are many varieties of physical ill health, there are many varieties of mental ill health. In both cases, a simple problem may be easily sorted, but often there are multiple factors involved, and if these are all to be dealt with properly, it will take time. A whole range of problems can lead to mental ill health, and for example, as Alison Johnson and the Greens have said, and Keith Brown as well, poverty, inequality, insecure work can all be factors. Also, loneliness and isolation was an issue we looked at when I was in the Equal Opportunities Committee in the previous session, when, if I remember, Mary Fee was the chair. And frankly, the public sector is not always the best placed one to deal with issues like loneliness, as I think Brian Whittle touched upon. Rather, it is often family, friends, neighbours, the third sector, who have the time and the capacity with volunteers to befriend and spend time with someone who is lonely. So absolutely the public sector has a part to play in improving the nation's mental health, but let us not think that the public sector can deal with this all on its own. Clearly, we in Parliament are talking much more about mental health than we used to do, and the public are talking about it too. That in itself is good, but it does probably raise expectation levels as to what we can do to improve things. Men in particular are talking more about their mental health than they used to, and especially thanks to the openness of certain high-profile footballers and other sportsmen. Traditionally, men have not been as good as women in opening up about their feelings, unless perhaps after serious quantities of alcohol. And there certainly seems to be a gender aspect to mental health. In Greater Glasgow and Clyde, depression amongst women has been shown to be 144% higher than amongst men, and conversely, anxiety was higher in men than in women, and perhaps we'll not be surprised that mental health-related drug deaths were 65% higher in men, while mental health-related alcohol deaths were 71% higher. Now, resources are an issue in all of this too, and financial resources have to come from somewhere, primarily from either tax or from reallocating resources from elsewhere. But I'm afraid I do not see any mention of that in the Lib Dem motion. It is all very well asking for improved services or more spending, and I accept that that is one of the roles of opposition parties. But a responsible opposition party will also be willing and able to say where such resources should come from. Oh, I was expecting the Lib Dems, but I'll take it from Mr Whittle.
Brian Whittle.
I'm just a bit quicker than Willie Rennie. I thank the member for taking the intervention. Obviously, finance is hugely important, but surely as well how you spend that finance is of equal importance. I think this kind of was what I was trying to allude to in my speech.
John Mason.
Yes, I mean, I do accept that point. I mean, how we spend money is important, and there's always room for improvement on that. But I think we are constrained by the total resources that we have, both in money and also in people. And if I'm reading the motion correctly, the Lib Dems are asking for more than 800 extra mental health workers. And it is perhaps worth remembering that we are near full employment in this country, and we do need the immigration rules to be relaxed if we want to increase the labour force for this and other reasons. And I accept Beatrice Wishart touched on this point, and I accept that the Lib Dems want us to remain in Europe, want freedom of movement, and therefore want more workers to be able to come here. But I think some other parties have not been quite so honest about that. As others have said, I was out for a day with the police during the summer, and as I think other members were in their areas. And a major theme that came across to me from the range of police officers that day was the amount of time that officers are having to spend with folk who have mental health issues. Clearly, that will include very serious cases where individuals are threatening to or have attempted to commit suicide. Social work or health staff may not be able to attend in a short timescale, and so police officers are required to stay sometimes for hours with a person with a serious mental health problem. Even if the police take a person to the NHS, for example, to accident and emergency, that person cannot just be delivered by the police and left, but they have to wait with them until they are seen, and that in itself might take hours. I mean, I was taken aback by one figure I saw which suggested that 20% to 40% of police time can be involved in incidents with an element of mental health. And it was reported that one year, 2016 I think, there were some 57,000 mental health entries on the police database. Callum Steele of the Scottish Police Federation is quoted as saying, "It is a fundamental failure of the system that the ambulance service can step back knowing that the police service will be there." Now, I do not think that is a criticism of the ambulance service or social work or hospital A&E, but it seems strange to me that other services can say they are too overstretched and the police are the ones who cannot say no. Surely there has to be a better way of dealing with such cases than tying up so much police time. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am certainly agreeing that mental health is hugely important. It deserves a huge amount of our attention, and it certainly deserves a commitment from our resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mason. And we move now to winding up speeches. I call Monica Lennon on behalf of the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to Willie Rennie and the Liberal Democrats for tabling this debate on the worrying mental health crisis and the urgent action that needs to be taken to better support all of our constituents. Several members rightly talked about the impact of austerity, poverty, inequality and universal credit, and Mary Fee, Beatrice Wishart, Annie Wells, others talked about the pressure on our public services, on workforce pressure, including on teachers, and of course the police is set out by Willie Rennie at the beginning. But others talked about their own personal experience, directly or in their family. Jeremy Balfour, James Dornan and Mark MacDonald. And I think that reminds all of us that we all have mental health and that perhaps we have more in common than we realise. Mary Fee set out in opening why Scottish Labour supports the motion today and why our amendment focuses on young people and the worrying increase in deaths by suicide among Scotland's young people. Also the pressures on CAMHS and the need to boost crisis support, especially over the forthcoming festive period. As I said to Mark MacDonald earlier on, suicide in young people under 18 has steadily increased. 160% increase since 2014. And I think all of our thoughts are with everyone who's been affected by suicide. But if I can just touch briefly on Lanarkshire, where I live, communities have been saddened by the tragic loss of young lives to suicide recently, including in my own daughter's school, which brings it very close to home. And I recently told the First Minister about my young constituent, Kyle, who completed suicide earlier this year at just age 14. Kyle and his mum went to their GP, but crisis support wasn't made available. He was told about long waiting times for specialist CAMHS services, but devastatingly for his friends and family, he died just a few days later. Kyle's brave mum feels that still there is not enough being done to help young people and their families when they experience poor mental health. We've all talked about CAMHS being under increasing pressure. And I know that in Lanarkshire, there's been significant increases in the numbers of referrals and urgent referrals. Other members talked about the impact on education and also the role that teachers play, often in being there in the front line and picking up the pieces. But I was looking at the submission today from the EIS, and they say that 76% of educational professionals in Scotland describe themselves as being stressed frequently or all of the time. We heard about some encouragement developments, and the Minister talked about the Distress Brief Intervention Scheme piloted also in Lanarkshire, and that has been very successful. The extension to 16 and 17-year-olds is welcome, and I join him in commending the board and the staff who picked up their recent award at the Scottish Health Awards. He'll also be aware that Sam H is calling for the national rollout of DBI for 16-year-olds and over, and I'd be grateful if the Minister could give a commitment to this today. Ministers know that investment in school-based counselling has been a long ask of Scottish Labour to the Government and others, and that North Ayrshire Council has led the way on this. I think we all desperately want to see this rolled out in all schools without any further delay. The Minister said at the beginning that Government has made a number of meaningful responses, but I would gently say that warm words, which often end up just being warm words, are meaningless to families who continue to fall through the cracks of services such as youth services, education and the NHS that don't have enough of the right resources. All of us know families who have struggled to access crisis support. And too often people are given the poor choice of turning to a busy and noisy A&E or to the police. And I think we've heard today some really harrowing testimony from Willie Rennie and others about the impacts on our police officers. We know that mental health crises don't just happen within 9 to 5 hours, and our community mental health teams need to be better equipped to offer a truly 24/7 response and provide a trauma-informed response. My brave constituent, Karen McKeown, has publicly spoken out before about the barriers she faced prior to her partner Luke completing suicide between Christmas and New Year 2 years ago. Karen and Luke were passed from pillar to post, turned away from mental health services, partly because of previous substance misuse, only to be told by addiction services they would have to seek separate help for mental health. Minister, there should be no wrong door. Karen gave compelling evidence to the Public Petitions Committee on the need for change, and I see Brian Whittle nodding, and I know that he was in tears that day. I share Karen's disappointment at both the Scottish Government's response to the committee and the fact that her petition was closed last week. I urge the Government to listen more carefully to people like Karen, who's already met the Mental Health Minister, and take urgent action. Several members have talked about staffing, and I'll try and finish quickly here. A member of staff shared with me their experience of the lack of support available in community mental health teams. Staff are feeling not listened to and unable to provide the patient care they feel they could if they had the right facilities. They continue, there are often no rooms available to see patients who have been assessed as higher risk, who are often mentally distressed and under the influence of substances. That's what's happening on the ground. Presiding Officer, Scotland is facing a mental health crisis. I urge the Scottish Government to redouble its efforts, end the long waiting times and the unnecessary barriers that too many Scots are forced to endure.
Thank you very much. And I call Miles Briggs to close for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to close this debate for the Scottish Conservatives and welcome this opportunity for the Parliament to debate mental health. Willie Rennie and Liam MacArthur outlined that mental health is such an important topic for so many individuals and families right across Scotland. And I've always supported the call for mental health and physical health and to enjoy parity of esteem. And I welcome that cross-party support which we see for that. But as Neil Findlay has outlined, and as what is, I think, at the core of this debate, that means nothing if it's not backed up by services when people need them. Now, we've heard today about the extent of the Scottish Government's failing around mental health services right across a range from mental health services for adults, but especially for CAMHS, which Annie Wells rightly highlighted and outlined in our amendment in this debate. And I have to say to SNP ministers that attempting to delete crisis from the Lib Dem motion I think is concerning, because for many of us, and it's been outlined in this debate today, when people come to speak to us at our surgeries, they are seeing the crisis in mental health services so many people and families face across our country today. Now, in terms of the debate and some of the key points which are outlined in terms of our public sector, I think it's important to note what's been said about the police service, but also for our NHS service, people who work in our NHS as well. They are often the people at the forefront of crisis for many of our fellow Scots. And we've seen some welcome progress in trauma-trained emergency services. That is welcome, but it's also a response to that crisis. And we need to see actually the preventative side of this really being brought forward, and something which we haven't really heard from ministers. Now, Mary Fee outlined young people in her contribution. I welcome that, and the Scottish Sun's campaign around Mind the Future, I think, is a really important one to contribute to this debate as well. Almost a third of children are waiting too long for mental health treatment in Scotland today, with the most recent figures showing that more than 30% of children are not being seen within the 18-week waiting time target. This is unacceptable, and I've heard ministers saying they agree with that. But it's deeply concerning that for all of us, the importance of early, swift treatment for mental health challenges in children is actually realised. Interventions which can make such a difference in preventing less serious issues developing into much more serious ones, and which can obviously lead into adult life for many people as well. This is a point which was made in Bernardo Scotland helpful briefing for today's debate, that the level of referral now to treatment by rejected treatment by CAMHS is of huge concern, with too many families being left to cope on their own. Audit Scotland has warned that it's not clear how SNP ministers are actually going to meet the crisis around mental health services, and that's a warning I think ministers should take on board. We've also heard the workforce planning around this is not fit for purpose. The Royal College of Physicians have talked about a workforce crisis, with children's provision in services amongst the worst affected. Indeed, the college's 2019 census revealed that more than 1 in 6 consultant posts in children's mental health services are unfilled today in Scotland. That's what's causing the excessive waiting times that too many of our fellow Scots continue to face. And here in my own region, as Neil Findlay outlined, parents regularly contact me about the horrendous delays their children are experiencing, delays which they're told to come back when they get worse. That's not on. That is where we need to actually see action, because we are seeing our health services letting down some of my constituents' most vulnerable children and young people, and that's simply not acceptable. Now, the Cabinet Secretary for Education has joined us, and I welcome the fact that he's been in for this debate, because I think we need to see that cross-portfolio approach. Last week, myself and Tommy Shepherd attended a student roundtable at Edinburgh University, and they're doing a lot of good work, and I'd like to praise them for this, in setting up support groups to actually look out for vulnerable students, many of them at Edinburgh University who are international students, and so it's out of term time when they need the support. But what was telling is what they warned us about was actually the peer support group now. These peers who have volunteered to get involved, they now need support because they've taken on so much of the concerns of their fellow students, and that support isn't there for them. So I think and hope this is an opportunity. I intend to write to the Cabinet Secretary about what they're proposing to take forward, where we can actually bring forward solutions. Now, I'm proud of the fact that over the last few years, Scottish Conservatives have worked closely with mental health organisations and argued for a range of new policies to improve mental health services by boosting social prescribing, increasing awareness, and looking towards tackling some of the underlying issues, such as loneliness, which often then leads on to poor mental well-being for so many Scots. There's so many brilliant health charities working across Scotland to try to turn this situation around. We should be supporting them and looking to expand the services that they provide. Jeremy Balfour made, I think, the most excellent speech of today's debate, which we've seen, and that was really going to the point of the need to look towards a family and person-centred support. And that's something I hope in the future we can look towards how we can actually fund often smaller groups who will be very community focused, but just need that small amount of funding often to sustain or start up a service. Finally, some of the points outlined by Lewis MacDonald and Jenny Gilruth in terms of some of that positive work often young people are undertaking. We had young people in the public gallery at the start of this debate, and I hope they understand that this Parliament does listen and take forward these issues. But we need to see more action from ministers to achieve that and to build best practice, because simply building the best crisis service in the world is simply not good enough for our fellow Scots. So I hope if anything comes out of this debate today, ministers will understand that not all is fine in Scotland, that many of us have real concerns over where our mental health services are going, and that they will look to work with parties across this chamber when we bring forward suggestions, because at the minute it feels like we're not taking forward some of the real action we need to. That's not good enough. That's not good enough for Scots who need services now, and I hope ministers will actually take this debate as a warning call, because like with drug and deaths we've seen in Scotland, they've admitted that we have a public health emergency in drug deaths. Increasingly, it looks like our health services, our mental health services are in crisis. We need to see action, and I hope they'll take that on board from this debate.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Jean Freeman.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Let me just start by responding to Mr Briggs. I think that what you see from this government is action. You may disagree about whether it's enough, whether it's fast enough, but I don't think that you can deny that we have not taken significant steps, some of which I will cover, some of which I will also try to cover why the pace of what we see is not as fast as members might want, or indeed I might want, but then, we have a choice between collaborating with partners, and therefore we might go at a slightly slower pace than we might otherwise want, or you just want me to direct things. Trust me, if that's what you want me to do, I will happily do it. Can I say to Ms Lennon, I think what you asked me, forgive me if I've got this wrong, was about the associate programme in terms of distress brief interventions. If it was, I'm happy to let you know that that associate programme for health and social care partnerships is available now. They can use the tools and the resources of the distress brief intervention programme to embed connected, compassionate support. If I've not entirely covered what you've said, just let me know and I'll get back to you. Presiding officer, I think improving mental health and providing the right support in the right place is a priority for this government and indeed across the chamber. And can I join others in thanking the Liberal Democrats for giving this debate their full amount of time? I think that was an important choice they made. And I think we also agree that seeing parity between physical and mental health in practice as well as in our attitudinal approach is also something that we share across this chamber as an intention that we all have. It does indeed need transformational change. It was the task group we set up that said that. But transformational change, by its very nature, does not happen instantly or quickly. And that is why I think what we need to look at is not only the steps that we've taken and recognise them, as Mr MacDonald said, in a fair debate, but then look critically at what more we need to do. So the steps we've taken, we are on track to meet that commitment of 800 additional mental health workers. We have not diluted that commitment in any respect at all. But indeed, some of what Mr Whittle said is precisely pointing to those other settings where mental health workers' support is important. And I think it does need, in part, to be led by what local bodies and organisations, including our IJBs, who have that responsibility, are telling us about where in their local area that makes most sense. And as we publish the projections in the future, I've got a lot to go through, but I'll try if I can later, then I am happy to give you where they project they are going to put those additional 800 mental health workers, the 400 or so that they've still got to recruit. £60 million investment in school counsellors. And I share Ms Fee's concern that, I wish when we'd announced it, we could have done it. It was money, resources channelled through our local authorities, channelled to make sure that schools can add value to what they already do. That takes time to work out. That's why the announcement of the actual amount of money and how it will be disbursed and what will happen with it happened yesterday. Investment in school, additional investment in school nurses, investment in further and higher education counselling services, mandatory mental health and suicide prevention training in the NHS, and happy also to report that that is offered to teachers in schools as well. And now significant progress in setting up those community mental health and wellbeing services. But as I say, this is a collaborative piece of work, primarily with our local authorities. Let me turn, though, to the points that were made about the third sector by Mr Whittle, Mr MacDonald, Mr Balfour, a number of others. I think you make really powerful points that are really important about the range of services that can be made available to help people in areas of their life where they experience distress, mental distress. And a lot of that work done early, it's partly why we have school counsellors, but partly why what the third sector offer us is really critical to stop those distressing periods becoming a crisis. And I think you make an important point too about how that is funded, I can tell you that recent investment of £250,000 to third sector organisations of varying sizes has been made to support counselling and befriending support. But I do think there is more that we need to do in order to be able to support the small organisation doing really good work that, as Mr Balfour said, just needs a room to work from, or a kettle, or enough coffee, or whatever, in order to make that work. And they fall below some of those that we fund. So I'm very happy, Mr Whittle, forgive me, I'm very happy to sit with you and with others and work out how we might do that as an additional strand to this work, because I think it is critical in mental health, but also in the area of social prescribing. I need to make progress, though. People have said, can I just make the point, CAMHS workers have increased by 76% since 2017. The number of posts in psychiatry has increased in the last 5 years. Rejected referrals and transition work, Mary Fee's point, very important, and we do need to increase the pace on that. But Lewis MacDonald made a really important point about what I saw in Aberdeen and what he described, and that was the real importance of service redesign with users involved that will make a significant difference to the speed of service, the right service in the right place, bringing in nutritionists and others that will make a big difference. So redesign is really critical here. Let me though make two final points, Presiding Officer, if I may.
Conclude.
Context is all, and that is why it is important. No, I'm afraid I don't have time. That is why it is important to hear what Alison Johnson and others are saying about the impact of another government's policies on the quality of people's life that produces those mental stresses and that additional impact on their mental health. And we can't shake our head and ignore that. It matters. That is why, from us, we are happy to support Mary Fee's amendment and would ask members to support ours.
Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I would call on Alex Hamilton to wind up our debate.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In his opening remarks, Willie Rennie revealed to the Chamber the full extent of the mental health crisis in our police force. And I was very dismayed that the Cabinet Secretary singularly failed even to acknowledge that in her closing remarks just now. That a third of our police officers are going to work whilst mentally unwell is worrying indictment of how we in this society watch out for those we pay to watch out for us. That so many are resorting to self-medication with alcohol and barbiturates just to get through is very troubling. And that almost half are exhausted should give us all real concern. That's made all the harder by the increase in mental health cases they have to deal with while on shift. Presiding Officer, that malaise is not confined to our police service. Ambulance workers repeatedly report high levels of stress and depression. Much of this mental ill health in all of our emergency services is triggered by unresolved trauma and stress at work. This itself is often caused by what those workers have to bear witness to. Andy Cunningham is my constituent. He is a paramedic at the National Risk and Resilience Centre in West Edinburgh. In a letter to me, which he has allowed me to share with you, he described the moment he realised he needs support and he wasn't coping as well as he thought he should. Andy was called to the scene of a suicide of a young woman in Edinburgh, and he writes, "My feelings whilst trying to retrieve a young deceased female from Leith Docks? Nothing. No feeling at all at the time, other than I nearly lost her whilst trying to hook the body in. That night I reflected on why I had become so numb to death. I'd seen hundreds of dead people. At the time, I'd lost my father and 2 close friends and a cousin to suicide. I knew I wasn't feeling right. I felt so numb and alone, it didn't feel good. I knew it wasn't normal for one human to feel nothing for another, and that's when I knew I needed to speak to somebody. I was lucky in that I took some time off. I found a counsellor that listened and helped with my perspective, that in time I was able to return to work. I still see that young girl's body every single day and will do so for the rest of my life. Others aren't so lucky. They're traumatised by what they see and they are broken. They are broken for life, but the lucky ones survive. I'm grateful to him for his courage in sharing that story with me. And he describes himself as lucky, and he is in many ways. He found a pathway to support. But there is no bespoke pathway for emergency workers experiencing any kind of post-traumatic stress. And that was represented amongst police officers with crystal clarity in the devastating research passed to the Scottish Liberal Democrats, which revealed that only 3% of officers agree that the national force care about their well-being. So I am proud to be working alongside Andy and other relevant stakeholders in the Blue Light Service to press this government to develop a national first responder trauma recovery strategy. But we need to do much more, and it's not just for blue light workers. Many speakers this afternoon have rightly pointed to the fact that Scotland's mental health crisis reaches every aspect of our society. Beatrice Wishart pointed to the fact that this government's amendment this afternoon removes the word crisis from our motion, and Annie Wells went on to demonstrate the depth of that crisis in the workforce at the start of the debate. Presiding Officer, if children are consistently being turned away from acute inpatient care when they are at time of crisis for want of staff, if that is not a crisis, then I do not know what is. The plight of children seeking help was taken up by others, Mary Fee and Jenny Gilruth. Mary pointed rightly to the fact that 5,000 children in this country have waited more than 18 weeks for care. And there is undoubtedly a correlation between that number and the very worrying and devastating uptick in child and adolescent suicide, touched on by Alison Johnston and Liam MacArthur and Monica Lennon in all of their remarks. We are in a crisis, and I must say, I found Keith Brown's remarks indecorous at best. He used his time almost exclusively to attack my party. And there will come a day, presiding officer, when he finds something else in the tank to come at us with, but it is not this day. And I challenge him to explain to those parents in my constituency whose kids are self-harming and waiting a year for children why they should be satisfied with his cheap attacks on other parties when he refuses to explain or even acknowledge the extent of his own government's failure. The response of this government to all of this, I don't have time, has been nothing short of dreadful, and that was covered with passion by Neil Finlay. A national mental health strategy, 15 months later. Suicide strategy, later still. We live in a Scotland where any one of us was struck with appendicitis, you'd be in surgery by the end of the day. But if you went to your GP with anxiety or depression or self-harming behaviour, you would join the longest queue in our National Health Service. And our services are buckling. Nowhere is that more evident than in Tayside. I spoke with Gillian Murray this morning, who's the niece of David Ramsey, who took his own life after being turned away at Carsview. She's still reeling from the fact that that service and that health board have not learned the lessons or the recommendations from the independent review. Presiding officer, the Liberal Democrats have fought and fought again for increased provision in mental health. And we finally won some sort of a commitment when the government agreed to put 800 workers in a range of settings. But what are those workers actually doing? Are they even mental health practitioners? We asked the Health Secretary. She couldn't tell us. The level of detail, she said, and we quote, was varied. In fact, all the signs are that the government couldn't tell us, even if it did know, because we've had to ask the Information Commissioner to intervene. The Scottish Government has repeatedly refused to tell us how the 800 staff will be shared out. We know one thing. The police service has a miserable 7.5 new workers in total so far. But how many will they get in the end? Nobody knows. There is no good reason for the secrecy. If there are robust plans, then the government should be able to show them us today. Instead, we're being told they need to be kept secret so that that policy can be developed. Presiding officer, the purpose of this debate is to shine a spotlight on the deeply worrying state of our police and their morale, to draw attention to the secrecy of the Scottish Government on the rollout of the 800 additional personnel for mental health, to express concern that the personnel may not be mental health professionals and that they are being diverted to other settings away from A&Es, GP practices, prisons and the police. Liberal Democrats want a step change. We want services to really operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That would be truly transformational and would get people the help they need and get it fast. There is no reason that the government should oppose this motion today if it is a reasonable and it is realistic. Only a complacent and out-of-touch government would object to what we propose. And I urge members to support our motion.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate on mental health. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 20051 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thanks very much. No member wishes to speak against the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 20051 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is consideration of 3 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I ask Graham Day, on behalf of the Bureau, to move motions 20052, 20053 on approval of SSIs and 20054 on public services reform, the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman Healthcare Whistleblowing Order Statement of Principles?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So we turn to decision time. The first question is that Amendment 20035.4 in the name of Jean Freeman, which seeks to amend motion 20035 in the name of Willie Rennie on mental health, be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20035.4 in the name of Jean Freeman is yes 60, no 44. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that amendment 20035.2 in the name of Annie Wells, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Willie Rennie, be agreed. Are we agreed? No. Or not agreed? We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20035.2 in the name of Annie Wells is yes 44, no 60. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 20035.1 in the name of Mary Fee, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Willie Rennie, be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next question is that motion 20035 in the name of Willie Rennie as amended on mental health be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20035 in the name of Willie Rennie as amended is yes 66, no 38. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. And I propose to ask a single question on the three parliamentary bureau motions. Does any member object? That's good. The question is that motions 20052, 20053 and 20054 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move to members' business shortly in the name of Rona Mackay on 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We'll just take a few moments for members and ministers to change seats. Just a pause.